There is this wonderful, dare I say strange story in the 17th chapter of the book of Exodus. The context is this. The Hebrew people are no longer slaves in the land of Egypt. They are on their way to the promised land. But for 40 years they are wandering through the wilderness. During this time period, the Hebrew people come into contact with the Amalekites. You see, as the story unfolds, I imagine the Amalekite people are on one side of a ridge, the Hebrew people are on the other. Neither group wants to attack the other. You don't want to give up your elevated position that's highly defensible. So instead, eventually, both groups send some soldiers down into the valley to fight against one another. As both sides run down to face one another, a strange thing happens. The Hebrew people look up and they see Moses standing there, arms raised, staff in hand, and filled with courage and the power of the Spirit. They advance on the Amalekites. In fact, they are winning. And then they look up and they notice that Moses has dropped his arms, the staff is no longer raised, and the Amalekites begin to advance. This goes on over and over again, back and forth. The Spirit of God is so intertwined with Moses, it goes back to all the way to the Red Sea. Moses raised his arms, right, staff in hand. The Spirit of God came, blew apart the waters of the Red Sea, and the Hebrew people marched forward. Essentially, it's the same thing here. Moses raises his hands, staff in hand. The Hebrew people look up. The Spirit of God is with them. They are filled with courage and they are able to advance forward. The problem is Moses is tired. Moses can't raise his arms that long. Of course, if you would have told Moses this 10 years ago, 15 years ago, he would have laughed at you. Back in the day, Moses, he could have raised his arms up all day. The idea that young Moses would have thought someday I'm going to have to lift a stick above my head and that's going to make me tired. Are you kidding me? Moses would have fought the toughest guy in Egypt back in the day. Back in the day when he was taking care of his father-in-law's sheep of Midian, he would have fought wolves with his bare hands. That's how big, strong, tough Moses was. But now, Moses is getting tired. It's because Moses is getting older. I don't know if it's his rotator cuff. I don't know if there's a glitch in the shoulder. I don't know if it's his trap or his lats. I don't know what it is. I just know that Moses' body can't do what it used to do, and that must be frustrating. It's frustrating for Moses because it's frustrating for all of us. Aging can be really hard. And there are these moments in life, it's like our bodies sneak up on us and say, oh, by the way, you're getting older. I remember the moment it happened to me. I took a group of kids from my former congregation. We went on this youth trip. There were a variety of kids from other churches there, a number of adult leaders, and there was this moment late in the week where we were all kind of gathered around. We were waiting for the leaders to come out from who were actually leading the youth experience. We had about 15 minutes to kill, and for some reason, one of the group of kids from another church started trying to guess their pastor's age. He seemed like a really good guy, very, very wise. I really liked him. He was probably about 50 years old. And I still remember how heartbroken he seemed when his kids guessed that he was probably 65. And then they went around and all these kids started guessing the ages of the adults. There was probably 10 adults in the room. They guessed everyone's ages. And basically on average, they guessed the adults to be 10 years older than they actually were until they came to me. And then there was a young person from our church. Her name was Ella, wonderful kid, still haven't forgiven her for this. She leans forward and she looks at me, kind of close, like gets right here, is looking at the side of my head, and all of a sudden she pulls back. She gets this serious look on her face. She looks almost like she's lost her coloring, like she has a touch of the flu. She turns to the others and she says, guys, PJ has gray hair. And all the other kids in that moment, it seemed like they leaned back from me. One moment I'm this young, charismatic pastor full of energy, and the next minute I'm like a leper. Don't get close to PJ. He's got gray hair. Don't get too close to him. You might catch it yourself. Now in that moment, of course, I laughed. I pretended like it was funny, but deep down, at a very visceral level, I was upset. I was mad, not at Ella, not at the kids. I was really mad at myself. I was mad at my body for aging. It's not supposed to happen, right? Of Of course, it sounds ridiculous, but we all have these moments where all of a sudden we look in the mirror and we wonder, where did this gray hair come from? Or when did my forehead get so big? There's other moments where our bodies are telling us you're getting older. Like you go on a road trip and the next morning you wake up and you feel like you ran a marathon, but your body feels that way only because you were in the car a couple of extra hours. Or maybe you wake up one morning and you can't move your neck and it feels like you played in a high school football game that was especially brutal, and instead the only thing that happened is you slept on your pillow wrong. I mean, there's all sorts of things that tell you your body is getting older. It's like your body is trying to send you a message you do not want to hear. And from what I've been told by people in their 50s and their 60s, in their 70s, their 80s, and their 90s, it doesn't get any better. Your body continues to try to tell you something. Of course, we could run from this. We could deny the reality that we're getting older, or we could embrace it. We could embrace it and realize that maybe, just maybe, even our own bodies are trying to teach us a lesson. Indeed, I think our bodies are probably teaching us or trying to teach us the most important lesson there is to know. It's a lesson that I have had to learn over and over again, but it's a lesson I first learned when I was 21. You see, when I was 21, I was trying to figure out, what am I going to do with my life? Am I going to be a pastor? Am I going to be a teacher? Am I going to do something else? Should I go to seminary? What should I do? So I went to talk to one of the wisest people I knew. He was an Old Testament professor. Prior to that, he had been a Lutheran pastor. I thought, surely, if anyone's going to give me wise advice, it would be this guy. So I went to Professor Bizard and I just told him my whole story, and I waited for him to give me some advice. Tell me what I'm supposed to do with my life. Tell me what is the will of God for me. He refused. Instead, he said, Bowie, there's only two things in life you need to remember. At this point, I thought I should reach into my backpack and grab out my notebook, because if there's only two things, I should probably write them down. Bowie, the two things you need to remember are this. First, you are going to die. This is not exactly the inspiring words I had hoped to hear. I mean, I'm 21 years old. Sure, I'm going to die like 200 years from now, but how does that affect me today? Second, he said, before I could object, and I knew what he was going to say. Why would I go to a Lutheran pastor? I began to think, you're going to die is number one. Number two is, but you're saved by grace through Jesus Christ. Okay, fantastic. You've told me the same thing in my Lutheran history class. This isn't really the advice I'm looking for. Of course, that's not what he said. I wish it was what he had said, but instead he said this. First, Bowie, you're going to die. Second, your family and friends, all of your loved ones are going to gather around to say goodbye. And 30 minutes after they kick dirt on your casket, they're going to go back to a dimly lit church basement where they're going to eat ham sandwiches and talk about the weather.
So nice enough day for it.
I just stood there thinking, no wonder this guy wasn't a pastor anymore. I mean, you can't give advice like this. I bet they kicked him out of the church. Before I could tell him exactly what I thought of him, he paused and he said, so the point is, live the life today that God wants you to live. Because this life you're living, it's going to go by faster than you can imagine. People of God, that's the lesson our bodies are trying to teach us. Every time our shoulders crack, every time our back feels stiff, every time we find another gray hair, our bodies are saying you aren't going to be here forever. You get one chance, you get one life. So live it fully. You get one life to make a difference in your community. You get one life to love your family to the best of your abilities. You get one life to be the best friend you can possibly be. You get just one life to do all these things. It is easy to go through life putting off the things we want to do today or tomorrow, the most important things, and say, oh, I'll get to them eventually. And instead spend our time on a bunch of other stuff that frankly doesn't really matter. What our bodies are trying to tell us, every time we realize that we are in fact getting older, our bodies are trying to tell us we get one life. So live it with a sense of urgency. And if you want to know how you can live out this life with a sense of urgency, you go back to the 17th chapter of the book of Exodus. Notice what happened to Moses. It took a while, but eventually, as Moses goes from this to this, finally, Moses asks for help. He turns to other people in the community and they come and they help him. And when at first they hold the arms of Moses up And when the people holding his arms get tired, they grab some rocks and they bring them over and they help stabilize the arms of Moses, staff in hand, and they stand there with him. People of God, this is what leads the Hebrew people to victory. This is what allows, the support of the community is what allows Moses to live the life Moses was supposed to live.